in this session, we're going to focus on Okta, and I have here two environments that were connected to Salto. We have here a dev preview and a production environment. Now, as soon as we connect Salto to an Okta tenant, Salto will fetch that configuration into Salto and will generate the tree structure that you see here on the left side. We can run that fetch manually. We can also run it on a scheduler, like nightly, like daily or hourly, etc. Now, for all of the different configuration elements in Okta, we generate those records here on the left side. On the left side, this should seem familiar, right? We can see our access policies, our applications, our brands, authorization servers, group rules, password policies, really everything that you can typically customize and configure in Okta. Let's try and look at one of these. For example, we have here a custom authentication policy. Now, as I mentioned, behind the scenes, Salto has a textual representation of everything that we have here. This one is very simple. But the interesting part is that we automatically understand all of the different dependencies of those different configuration elements. For example, here we can say that this authentication policies, it is dependent on these 5 different access policy rules, and is being used by this specific application. And we can drill down. For example, I can go to this access policy rule. I can see all of its content. By the way, this would be a textual representation of it. Relatively simple and very readable. That's a language called NACL, N-A-C-L. And we can see, for example, that this one depends on a specific group and a specific network zone. I can drill down to that network zone and see, well, it is being used by these different 5 other configuration elements, right? These 2 password policy rules, this one sign-on policy rule, etc. So that's the first step of creating proper visibility and understanding potential impact of changes. Everything here is searchable. I can go ahead and search for anything. And this is around creating that common language and basic common mechanism for collaboration within our team. But now let's go to something a little bit more interesting. So for this session, we're going to have a case where we need to develop a new access policy and would like to develop it in our development preview tenant and deploy it to our production tenant. Now, as any other organization, like you need to have control in the way that you do that. So I went ahead, this is Jira, right? And I created a ticket to create a new foobar access policy. It's an urgent new auth rule for the foobar project. We can see that it is tied to Okta, and let's say it was approved. I went and developed the relevant components of the change in my preview tenant, and now I'd like to go ahead and deploy it to my production tenant. So I went to this compare and deploy tab, and I would like to create a new deployment. Now, Salto supports a few different deployment strategies. The one I'm going to show you is comparing 2 different tenants, 2 different environments, and deploys based off those changes. I will quickly describe the 2 others. The first one is that we can find changes that happened in a specific environment since a point in time. For example, let's say you started a project on Jan 10, and you would like to see all the changes that happen in your preview tenant since Jan 10. You can just see those and then filter and deploy to their environment. We can also edit the textual representation of an environment directly in Salto or open a web-based IDE. This can be very useful for like bulk changes. Let's say that you had an M&A, you need to make a lot of changes to an instance. That can be a great way for doing that. But for this demo, we're going to stick to compare and deploy. Let's create a new one. So we're going to deploy from our Okta dev tenant to our Okta pro tenant. The title of our deployment is going to be our foobar deployment. And we're also going to link it to our Jira ticket that we created just before. So I'm going to create a new compare and deploy operation. As soon as I did that, Salto shows me all of the differences between my dev environment and my production environment. So you can very easily understand what are the differences between your preview instance, preview tenant, and your production tenant. By the way, this works between any two tenants. So if you have multiple production tenants, or if you have some kind of a like hub and spoke architecture where you need to deploy changes like that, you can do exactly the same with that. We're seeing that we have here 506 configuration additions that were done in our preview tenants but are missing in our production tenant, 58 modifications, meaning that the same configuration, 58, meaning the same modification, the same elements exist in both, but have some differences between them, and 309 deletions, meaning that they exist in prod, but not in dev. Let's take a look, for example, at a certain modification. We can see the actual changes, in this case, just a priority change of that, but we can see very clearly what are the changes between the two configuration elements. But for the sake of this demo, we have a new access policy that we created. This is our foobar policy. But everything here is searchable, filterable. We can see the details of this one. I'm just going to select it. As soon as I select it, Salto automatically detects dependencies and tells us, well, this foobar access policy, it's actually being used by these two other access policy rules, and by this application, I'd like to go ahead and select those access policy rules. I wouldn't like to deploy this application for now. So, oh man, we have a missing dependency. What does it mean? And we can see it here. We can see that the foobar access policy has some other dependencies. It depends on the foobar user type. So we'll select it. And right now, seems like we're good. There are some other optional dependencies that we can deploy, but right now we're basically staged for deployment. I'd like to preview this deployment. Now, there are multiple different flows that we can take from here. I'm going to show you a way to add some more control over the change. So I configured Salto to automatically go ahead and open a pull request in order to approve this change. What are we seeing in the screen? We're seeing, first of all, that these are the 4 configuration elements that are staged for deployment. All of these are additions. But I cannot deploy right now because we have a pull request which is pending. For those of you who are unfamiliar, pull request is a mechanism to review changes in GitHub. We support all the different Git providers. So I clicked on that link from Salto and got to GitHub. And we can see that, well, that's the change. And we can see the actual content, everything that is part of this change. This is linked back to that deployment in Salto, but we see that a reviewer is required. All right, so let's assign a reviewer. I'm going to assign our trusty Knuckles McKnuckle to review this change request. Knuckles is logged in here on this other browser. Let's just refresh this screen. All right, we can see that there's a review required on this pull request. I'm going into there. You can see that Gil requested my review on this pull request. So I'm going to add my review. It looks good to me. So I'm going to review those changes. Looks good to me. Approve. And I just need to move something from Zoom here. All right. And I can submit my review. All right. So this pull request is, the changes are approved. And we can go back. We can see that also in that GitHub account, it is approved. And when we go back to Salto, we can see that right now it's ready for deployment because it was approved. We could have also deployed it automatically, by the way, as part of a CI/CD pipeline. But now that it's approved, I'm just going to click deploy and push. Salto warns me that I'm deploying to a sensitive environment, to my production environment, that we're about to deploy these 4 new elements. I'm clicking deploy now, and that's basically it. Salto now is using the APIs to deploy those changes, and will merge also the changes on the Git side. It typically takes like a minute. All right, deployment successful. Everything was deployed. And it is syncing now back with Okta, making sure that everything was deployed correctly. And now it is also pushing those changes back to GitHub. Push to GitHub, and we can see those changes back in GitHub. Now, as you remember, we started this with a ticket on Jira, and we can see now that that ticket that we created is, if I just go and refresh my Jira screen, that it is linked to that pull request that was merged and to the commits that we made. All right, so very quickly, to recap, we saw how we understood the configuration of an Okta tenant, and how we easily deployed changes between tenants. And we can be as granular or as really, we can deploy at whatever scale that we'd like. We can also monitor the configuration for certain changes. For example, I can create different notification rules that would alert me when something changes. For example, let me create a new notification. Let's call it, I don't know, changes to password policies, for example. And I'd like to get alerted on any change that happens in Okta to any, well, as the name says, any password policy, and you know what, any password policy rule. I'd like to get an email, or I can be notified on Slack. Let's do Slack. And I have my Gil tracker channel. And that's basically that. Every time that Salto will detect that a change was made to that relevant area, I will get an alert with all the details. All right, so that was a very quick demo of using DevOps principles for managing changes and in Okta and understanding Okta in a very controlled way, right? Adding approvals to that, adding visibility, tying back a change to a Jira ticket, etc.